globalization and resistance to it. And this topic is of particular interest, I think, because of all of the lectures, this is the one that is most directly an expression of the discontent with globalization, because it's actual resistance, actual physical and human resistance to globalization. So I'm looking forward to a very interesting talk. We have Dr. Marc Gilbert, who is the NEH Chair in World History at HQ, who's going to be giving the talk. Marc and I are old-time friends, and Marc's a great scholar and a great teacher, so we look forward to a very interesting talk.
Thank you. If I don't live up to that, it's solely his fault.
No, it's all on you now.
Well, I'm a world historian. So world historians are interested in big things like agriculture, the spread of commerce between cultures, religions. These are things that we specialize in. And for the modern period, at least since 1500, we've all experienced this thing called globalization, which really just means increased contact between the peoples of the world. The difference lately, and why we coined the word globalization, is because the pace of that change has accelerated in the last 30 years. So when we say globalization, there are a lot of things that mean globalization. You could argue that the Islamic empires were virtually global, but the idea here is in the last 30, 40 years, we've seen a change in the pace. And that pace actually is happening faster than human beings are able to adjust to it comfortably. This leads us to the only big name philosopher I ever use in class in an introductory talk, which is Thomas Kuhn. He wrote a book called Scientific Revolutions, and it said that culture cannot match the pace of technological change. So you're going to get friction. You're going to get friction no matter what happens when you have rapid technological change. And of course, technological change in the last 25 years has been driven by, globalization has been driven by technological change. Well, let's start with Francis Fukuyama. I lied. There are two philosophers. It's like Monty Python, right there. Many causes of the Spanish Inquisition. Francis Fukuyama is a very famous Harvard professor of economics, a very brilliant man. And in the 90s, he came up with a wonderful thesis. It was called The End of History. Marx talked about history as a function of the struggles between class against class. And when that ended, there'd be no history, because he said all the bad things that come, whether it's domestic violence to global warfare, are all a product of competition. And not competition, they're all a product of the fact that the economy does not function properly, people don't get what they expect from it. So, by the end of 1990, which is where we're going to pick up our story, the end of history, of course, made him a lot of money. He should be grateful for that, and we should praise him. But then he recanted what he said in his book. He said that capitalism is, in fact, the greatest producer of economic wealth. It is the greatest way of stimulating people to entrepreneurialism and productive economic activity. So the problem with it is it can't manage any kind of equal distribution of the results of that economic activity. So that we have to start with a definition that I think lots of professors say that. There's economic growth, which would be the production of wealth, and there's economic development, which is the spread of the number of people who participate in the development of that wealth and enjoy it. Now, there used to be two ideologies, one communism and the other capitalism in terms of economic ways of looking at the world. Communism claimed that it was going to have equal wealth amongst all. Capitalism said, well, that's not really the object. The object is to amass fortune through individual competition. And what happened in 1989 and 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. And with it, so did the communist global movement to a large extent. So the result of that was there was no alternative to capitalism, which meant that capitalism no longer had to struggle against a dying, inefficient system that we call communism. Now, in fact, Francis Fukuyama's words could be given life. And now we have, around 1999, Francis Fukuyama saying, sorry about that. There are problems of wealth distribution, and that's the major cause of global conflict. So we're going to see a lot of that now. I'm sorry, you historians can still keep your jobs. He didn't say that part because he's an economist. So what were the kinds of things that were happening which were causing problems? Well, fortunately, if I gave this lecture, say, 5 years ago, 10, we wouldn't know what 99% meant. the 1% versus the 99%. That's your generation's gift to the world, actually. Okay, and confirmed by the U.S. Bureau of Statistics. Ever since the American Revolution, actually, there have been rising income disparities. It's gotten bigger. That is between those who have and those who have not. But we're a very wealthy country. We stole lots of good land from Indians. And the result of that is that we've been able to manage these things. We've had our slums. We've had our problems with pollution. But we largely have been on top of them. That began changing when Fukuyama began noticing that capitalism, which the United States was the foremost proponent and the foremost beneficiary, was starting to have problems inside its own society. And, we should find out from this discussion, those same things were happening in all mature capitalist industrialized countries. So what happens in the United States actually ends up happening everywhere else, and the predictions of early resistance to globalization all came true. Now, we're going to talk about what can be done about that. It's not necessarily good or bad. The question is method, technique. It's not a question of, actually, I think it was Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg that wrote about what is to be done. What do you do when after the revolutions happened? The revolution in our lives is the triumph of capitalism. What are we going to do in the aftermath of that triumph? Okay, well, here's the biggest problem right up front. Political institutions in countries have not been able to keep pace with this single capitalist market. In fact, what's been happening is in order to stimulate the efficiency of the market, governments have withdrawn from controlling economic forces. So the idea is free trade, elimination of tariffs, emphasis on free movement of goods. This is all going to benefit everybody. Politicians find it a hard sell to say what we need now is more big government to protect us from what? There's no communism anymore, right? So let it run. Let's see what happens. And that meant that international economic institutions, which are actually they are funded by government, but are really non-governmental organizations that actually promote free trade and govern the finances of the world, they became more and more important. So power shifted away from government to multinational corporations, which are very efficient at exploiting and distributing resources, and to organizations like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And we've seen a lot of problems with both. As far as the World Bank is concerned, it's been correctable. In other words, the problems we're going to talk about they may be endemic, but things can be done to improve the way they interact for all the people in the world. IMF less so, because its real job is to make sure that capitalist institutions can function freely. Therefore, when it lends money to countries to develop, they often put requirements on it, which require the state to show it can pay the money back by cutting education and food resources for people. Because a government that can take food out of the mouths of its own people is strong enough to pay back the loan, and it's strong enough not to give into silly socialist impulses in which the state gives too much money, to the poor, and then they become dependent on it, as you know, they become totally dependent on it, and the result is it actually stifles wealth, entrepreneurialism, and growth. I'm being a little funny here, because it is a little funny, but it's also serious. Okay, so I was going to say, can I have the next slide, please? Unfortunately, I can do it myself. Okay, so the organizations like the IMF were dominated actually by the industrial powers, and you'll see how closely they are in just a minute or two. Market reforms that are introduced and accepted by governments actually are very odd, and one of them is NAFTA. This was one of the first, a North American free trade agreement. And what was interesting about this is NAFTA forbids the filing of environmental or personal damages against the companies in the free trade area for at least 6 months. Oh, okay. I grow flowers in Mexico for the American market. I am issued no equipment to protect myself from the pesticides used to kill insects that might kill the flowers. I use toxic chemicals and I get sick. The North American Free Trade Agreement says I can't file a claim against this company for at least 6 months. And then you start the long process of an individual worker suing a multinational corporation which probably owns that flower growing plant. So this this is an odd thing to find in a free trade agreement. Another part of NAFTA was nobody can own land collectively. That's too much like socialism. So every farmer must be the owner of his own property, which meant the people of Chiapas, Indians, who actually share ownership of land communally, were told they have to divide up all their land between individuals. And most of them said, if we do that, none of us will have enough land to grow anything that we can sell on a market. And the Mexican government responded by sending the military in to rape and kill the people of Chiapas, which so upset the people of Mexico City that they actually went on marches to stop it, because it was so inhumane. But this was actually part of the agreement. But you understand how important this is. You can't make a contract with a cooperative group very easily. You need to make an agreement with an actual owner of something that you're directly involved in. And of course, this was a very difficult time for Mexico, and it's been struggling with these issues ever since. But it was a harbinger, an early harbinger, that means foreshadowing, that maybe these trade agreements, had a dark side. Okay? And what made it even darker was this started happening in industrialized countries themselves. Lobbyists began attacking environmental policy and accusing environmentalists of being insane. Like, why keep this river from not being dammed because there's a rare endangered river fluke in it? That's stupid. In other words, making the best case by using the worst example. But we all do that. Ever been in an argument before? You go right down to the bottom very, very quickly. It's perfectly human. Okay. Now this gave rise, technology, to kind of new forms of protest that no one ever thought of before. And this is going to dictate where it's been and where it's going. Anti-globalization websites popped up, and they said things like, in particular, an extension of the North American Free Trade Agreement is essentially a mechanism for Canadian and American capitalists to gain effective control over public policy in a neo-colonial hinterland. There's multinational companies started looking at countries as the way imperialists did in the late 20th century. You didn't have to occupy the country with your own troops. In fact, you can control their economy from the outside. And I'm going to give you one example. You won't see the slide. It's just a newspaper clip. And a piece of the newspaper. But steel workers in Canada began protesting against the government of Canada's policies. Because what the government of Canada did is say that in the name of free trade, if China wants to dump cheap steel into Canada, that's okay. And they're not going to enforce what we call general rules of domestic industrial protection. That's in opposition of free trade. And so they're now protesting against their own government because their own government is letting China take their jobs away. Why would it do that? Well, the problem for capitalism in the past is that it's been restrained by these tariffs. Tariffs are things that make imported products more expensive to protect a local industry. And if you go back to the origins of capitalism with Adam Smith, he said there shouldn't be such things. He was very worried about monopolies and other evil things and actually promoted government control to prevent monopolies. But he said basically, you just have to let the best people at the best price produce the best commodity, and the market will shuffle everything out. They'll have a hidden hand, and everything will work rather well. But it turns out that governments were now aiding in the process, not just of stripping away the tariffs, but exposing their own industries. That could be called protectionism being taken away, and therefore good for capital development, but not to the steel workers of Canada. They said, that's not fair. You can't let this happen. Of course, there are mechanisms in which you can protest the dumping of cheap products, but those mechanisms take forever, and they take a large army of lawyers, which would say bankrupt the steel workers union, even that. So these were problems people began seeing. They had a name for it, drawn from old communist critique of capitalist policies, neo-colonialism. This started really getting bad in about the last 10 years. China, as you know, has just admitted actually that 20% of its agricultural land is polluted. Its population is growing. It needs resources it doesn't have. So it's basically going to places where it can buy influence into a country's economy. Most particularly, they go to dictators in Africa. There's deep kickbacks that go on beneath it. China's trying to buy up hundreds of thousands of acres in southern and eastern Africa, but the farms they're creating to grow food for the Chinese are all managed by Chinese. And the businesses they invest in are all run by the Chinese. They're bringing their own people out, not to train the local African population. This, by the way, is how Japan modernized. They said, you want to invest in our country, you've got to train our technicians how to do what you're doing. You'll get your profit. It'll be in a shorter term, that's all. But you have to give us our own chance to develop. And Japan had enough clout in the world system at that moment to do it. This is Robert Mugabe, who's a well-known dictator in Zimbabwe. And what I mean by dictator is there are two major ethnic groups in Zimbabwe. He represents one of them, and the others have no influence whatsoever. And he's president for life, which was really not from our point of view, criticism. Okay, now we get to things just less easily critical. Can I hear the laugh when you look at this slide in the middle? I just want to make sure we're all connected here. I'm mad, I'm bad, and I'm dangerous to know, and I've got billions. If you go to any resort, Thailand, Vietnam, any place, today you'll find a lot of people there are Russians. In fact, the hotel I stayed at in a beach resort, I was there for the Cham temples, but in the beach resort, the library, where people leave books for other people to get, was all po-Ruski, all of it, all Russian. So they're doing very well. The Chinese government has now become what they call socialism with, anyone know? Socialism with Chinese characteristics. Economists call this state capitalism. The state takes everybody's money and decides how to spend it. So the entrepreneur pays taxes, the state decides how it's going to be spent. And of course, since it's a communist state, the theory is it's going to spend it for the benefit of everyone, except that the ministers have more than billions of dollars in offshore accounts. One was just caught, and in fact, the former head of security, and one of the leading entrepreneurs in China has just been, his whole family's been under house arrest. Not because he's done anything illegal, but to send a message that, gee, if we want to survive as a communist party, we got to tone it down. The people of China were complaining because the government was being called the A6ers. In Africa, it's called the Wabenzi. Wa means people, Benzi means Mercedes-Benz. So the government are a special tribe called the Wabenzi, right? And it's true. I mean, I traveled in Africa, and you look in someone's garage, and if they're powerful and important, they've got these products. So the Chinese government got very upset and said, no more officials driving A6s. But you can buy the Chinese equivalent. So don't be so flashy. So this is all these revolutionary societies, like Vietnam as well, are shifting to this state, or have shifted to the state capitalist model. And what goes with it? Free education, gone. Social security networks, gone. When the Chinese government sells a corporation to a private entrepreneur, they allow the private investor, often Chinese, of course, a member of the party and the party's family, to erase the pension funds. Because then they can use the pension funds to help build and repair and grow the old, inefficient communist factory. But the point is, the workers, that's it. You were counting on this for your retirement. Oh, you just better keep working. And so these kinds of attitudes, which support, of course, vast wealth. There are more Chinese billionaires, I think, now than American ones. Close enough. It was creating a lot of inequality. Okay. As this happens, more people are complaining and calling it outright. It's imperialist. China buying up land, taking over land in Africa, setting up plantations where the plantation workers are African, but the owners and managers of the farm are foreigners. That's kind of rough, very exploitative. And inside each rich country, the same thing is happening, where wages for what used to be semi-skilled jobs are really pushed down and vanishing, and skilled jobs, high-paying skilled jobs, become harder. Even doctors actually have to work a lot harder for their money for a medical corporation, because medical corporations have to struggle with purchases of higher technology. So how much time can they spend with you? They need to see more and more clients, in other words, at the factory process. So this new economy is really rough on people. And there have been this problems of economic crises. Brazil almost went bankrupt and took the entire global financial system with them. So it's pretty dangerous. Okay, so in late November of 1999, there was a protest in Seattle against the World Trade Organization. So I'm going to walk you through this. What's the World Trade Organization? Well, it's a perfectly fine thing. It deals with making the global rules of trade between states to ensure that trade flows as smoothly as possible. Huh? The meeting in Seattle was designed to discuss further international tariff cuts, making trade easier to flow between countries. And what can be wrong with that? Ask a sea turtle. Now we're getting to the fun part. Ask a sea turtle. These are the protesters in Seattle the first day of the demonstration. Perfectly peaceful, nonviolent. As many people as possible made their own. Of course, it's so easy to make a turtle costume, because you all know that. You know, knew Michelangelo and actually, Michelangelo was a schoolmate of mine in high school. In fact, we were bar mitzvahed within like 2 days of each other. And he grew up to be president of the Screen Actors Guild. Very good. So everyone dresses up like turtles. And why is it a symbol? Well, because you can read it for yourself. Now imagine a shrimp boat. It's got a net a mile long. It's scarfing up all the shrimp from the sea, and it's scarfing up turtles as well. So the U.S. Endangered Species Act said you have to have a net that has a little window in it that turtles can find, and those nets exist, and turtles escape. Instead of being hauled up onto the deck of these processing things, where they're all in, well, think of Chicken McNuggets. You know, the stuff is just, anyway. The point is that this didn't seem really nice for the WTO to do. I mean, don't they need to be environmentally responsible? I mean, they're human. They know we live on this planet. Well, you know, who's going to miss the turtles, I guess. But, you know, we might end up with no shrimp. You know, what's going on here? Well, ask a French cheesemaker. Ask the consumer of Roundup Ready soybeans. Ask any opponent of genetically modified foods. Ask a European about American hormone-treated beef. Ask someone from a rainforest representative of all these groups for the first time got together in Seattle because the World Trade Organization was forcing people to do things that they didn't want to do. And we would say this is really a question of locality versus global, local versus global. Normally, there always have to be a conflict between the two, but in this particular case, you want to buy soybeans, and the cheapest soybeans have been genetically modified so that you can pour Roundup on the soybean crop, and it won't kill the crop, it won't kill the soybeans, it'll just kill the weeds. But you keep doing that, and the soil becomes penetrated with poison, and then it gets into the aquifer, and you drink it. Or there's remnants in the actual food itself that's made from the soybeans, and you're eating Roundup, essentially. Now that could be a rare case. There's an argument to be made. Almost all foods are genetically modified. I mean, if the apples we eat don't look like apples from the past. Corn, this is what I like to do. The original Indian corn, the corn we eat now, completely different. You know, those big yellow things that look like big front teeth. Oh no, that's not what the original corn looked like at all. And of course, the Incas bred the potato. You know, it didn't look like that. And since then, we've bred it even more. And sometimes we have to. The banana that we've been eating for the last 100 years, it now no longer exists because of a pest. It's been replaced by another banana, but that banana is now subject to that pest. So now they have to find another species of banana, tastes and looks the same because it sells well. And if they don't, you're not going to see Chiquita banana inexpensively. But I can say the same thing for each of these things. Europeans are not given a choice, really, in the marketplace about eating American hormone-treated beef because those hormones go into you. And I can actually give you graphic things that happen to people who eat adulterated products, but they're adulterated for your protection, mainly your pocketbook. Because a lot of these crops mean the food is cheap. If you go to a McDonald's because it's cheap, that's your choice. You don't have to eat that way. Well, if you're poor, though, and relatively uneducated to the value of food, which is a very hard thing to do, it's not really a choice, and that's an argument. The bottom line, though, is you eat bad things for you because you like it. Well, it's been stuffed with sugar and fat just for that reason. It's not Not naturally that way. This is my food and world history class. We talk about this all the time. But it's still basically your choice. These are not people's choices. The people of Britain are going to have to eat genetically modified foods. They're not going to have a choice. It's going to be in the marketplace and it'll drive out the organic products. Now, don't get too depressed. Walmart is starting a line of organic foods. And it's not going to be more expensive than the non-organic. Why? Because you've changed. You want organic food. That's the wonderful thing about capitalism. It's market sensitive. Now, of course, things to be done to adjust the market. You've all heard, we've known this for years in the food industry, Captain Crunch. Okay, the middle aisle, the middle shelf of every supermarket is where the sweetest things are because they know you want it. Okay? But Captain Crunch, his eyes are pitched at a downward angle of 9.3. So it looks right into the eyes of a child walking along with a parent. In other words, every possible genius is being harnessed to get you to buy something that's actually not very good for you. But, so it's hard to say it's just your choice when you're being manipulated. Or is it? I mean, this is a basic thing about human nature. Are we individuals responsible for our own actions? Or do we blame something on everybody else? Well, it's your choice. Okay, so all these groups for the first time really, and more as we're going to see, were all in Seattle concerned that the WTO was pushing things that were pushing these things on people, their people. And they didn't like it. And what's really amazing? For the first time in American history, steel workers and environmentalists got together. Now, if you didn't live through the 60s, you wouldn't understand this. But it was almost impossible, for example, for the anti-war movement to have any way of dealing with hard hats. It was hard hats against the drug addicts, you know, hippies versus hard hats. Everyone trying to be a stereotype of themselves. Not now. Now we had a condition in which steel workers and environmentalists and farmers and beef eaters and all these, they all found a way of banding together because the WTO's policies had become global and universal. So it was harming all these, perceived to be harming, all these people together, and I'll walk you just through one argument very quickly. So labor unions and environmentalists had become about the WTO's policies, and it's ranged from employment to deforestation. And I've softened this up, by the way. When I actually put this together, it was so horrible that it was hard for me to deal with emotionally, because these are human beings we're looking at here. Donald Fisher, Charles Hurwitz are very productive capitalists. Fisher was worth $3.3 billion when he died in 2003. They have families, sons, daughters, children. They can be support, in their particular cases, conservative philanthropic organizations. They're human beings. But at the WTO meeting, they were the chief target of the WTO protesters. And this is why. Fisher was actually one of the drafters of all of these international monetary organizations. And he wrote the rules for the WTO regarding textiles. What do you think? What do you think Fisher did to get his $3 billion? A company that he might be a CEO of? I don't know, what could it be? Founder and chairman of the board of Gap and Old Navy, which were notorious in the late 90s for sweatshops. In fact, he was called the father of the sweatshop. And if we follow the news today, those sweatshops have led to disastrous fires, just like the Triangle Fire in the United States back in the 1890s, when we were modernizing. So this is a process of modernization. You don't even need to blame it on globalization. People are seeking profits in new industries, and they end up cutting corners, and the cutting corners kill people. But that's why Donald Fisher ended up as an effigy during the World Trade demonstrators. Gap, of course, became a particular target because Fisher also had his fingers in some lumber issues, which we'll talk about in a minute. But the idea is this was one of the two acts which were blown up into actual assaults on downtown Seattle by critics of the protesters. You have about 40,000 people, probably more. They're downtown in Seattle. There are police lining a parade route, and the people are walking down the parade route with banners. There's no violence going on whatsoever. Certainly the 40,000 people aren't doing anything. But on the side, there are very pissed off people who are not part of the organizing committee, who have their own agenda. Now, wow, how could that happen, right? You know, and some of them, and I love that they fulfill all the stereotypes that you can imagine. It's very important. They're burning Gap products, not from the store. They apparently had to buy them. But the point is, they're out there and they're burning it outside of the Gap store, and then they start accosting people coming out of the Gap store, saying, "Don't you know these clothes are made in sweatshops?" Some then went into a McDonald's and told people that you realize that McDonald's food practices blah 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 blah. Actually, McDonald's is the most responsible food company of fast food companies because its margins are based on such a large number of customers. They don't want to piss any of them off. So they're actually ahead of the curve. In other words, they're good corporate capitalists. Of course, they're selling you sugar and fat, and they'll kill you. I'm making a joke, but Alice Waters said, when you buy cheap food, it is not cheap food, right? But you pay for it in a hospital later, the other end of your life. But in any event, McDonald's, McDonald's didn't do anything. People said, "Come on, join the march. Leave the fast food, come into the fast lane of opposition and to the degradation of humanity." Nobody left. A window was broken. That's it. I mean, there are probably people accosted too and things like that. No arrests, nothing happened. The police believed that Molotov cocktails were being thrown. The mayor panicked and called in the National Guard, fortunately unarmed. Last time the Guard was called in at a public protest led to 4 people dead in Ohio. Very few people understand what I'm talking about. Get the general idea. Okay. So, what about Charles Hurwitz? Fisher was head of Gap, things like that, sweatshops. What about Hurwitz? Well, actually, what I don't have up here, he actually pleaded guilty to securities fraud before the Security Exchange Commission. So he started out with a bad rap. But you can get better. He became CEO of one of the largest multinational companies in the world, also a director of Pacific Lumber and Kaiser Aluminum and Chemical Company. As you can start seeing, he did what corporate raiders do. You buy a company cheap that's in trouble. You get the court to say that you can seize the assets of the pension fund to pay off debts, and those debts are paid to you, in effect. As a company director, he reduced a worker pension benefit fund $4,000 a year. And this is very good management. Stockholders would be very pleased, and you'll get re-elected as a director of any company if you can raise the stock portfolio value of your company. And that's the point, isn't it? In a capitalist economy, the way you count coup is by showing that you're profitable, that you're efficient. Nothing bad about that, but pissing workers off, you could argue. He locked out 3,000 steel workers at Kaiser's factories because they didn't like their pensions being cut, their benefits being cut. But he was best known in Seattle for cutting down the last open range redwoods. And why not? Pacific Lumber bought forests, right? Right? You can buy land that has a forest on it, and aren't you entitled to cut down the trees? Of course you are. There's nothing immoral about that. But to an environmentalist, knowing that these are the oldest things in human existence, that there might be other values than pure profit, well, that's not why a company buys land. But it wasn't harvested responsibly, you might argue, and Pacific Lumber, after the WTO riots, changed its policy about clear cutting. In fact, the saddest thing about the whole thing I'm telling you is that capitalist enterprises respond to physical threat, which is really not the way you want to run the world. That's why I end the talk with Gandhi, just letting you know ahead of time. And here we go. One of the leaders of the Seattle protest, David Foster, was actually a steel worker at one time. That's how he started out. And he remarked that the companies that attack the environment most mercilessly are often, I might have a typo here somewhere, are often the ones who are most anti-human. And so you have this demonstration, 40 to 100,000 people marching through Seattle, a little bit of violence on some fringes. They're marching to, they're actually told that they have a zone that they have to stay in, and they're marching down the street towards the place where they can protest. This is the delegation for Save the Redwoods, actually, and the Global Association for Saving the Environment. Most of them were turtles in the beginning, but it's been raining and they've got, slippers on. And this is what happened. Officially, it was called a police riot later. Police were afraid that they could lose control of the crowd and that there were Molotov cocktails being thrown. And as they started pressing into the crowd, some people started throwing rubbish and stuff at the police. And their reaction was to fire tear gas canisters, rubber bullets, and hitting people with nightsticks. This once happened in a demonstration in Los Angeles, and after that the police were never seen at a public demonstration again. They were in SWAT trucks 3 blocks away. The very presence of police encourages confrontation. If there is disorder, the police should be close enough to be able to take care of it in a measured way. Here it was called a police riot. In retrospect, the mayor lost his job. So it's not like, what do you call it? Well, it depends on how you looked at it. It does. But in this case, people voted with their, people reacted with their votes. That's my favorite picture up there. The turtle matching loudspeaker with loudspeaker. The typical American protester. In the handout I've given you, which is just an article that talks about some of this, a French protester looked at the crowd and said, "You Americans have just lost your ability to have a protest. You know, you just stand around and you're peaceful. You know, I don't know what's the matter with you." But fortunately, they knew if police attack you, then you just should lay down. This isn't laying down in protest like blocking a store, because it's not that. They were just responding to the what the police were using. And you know, when things really get bad, American protesters set fire to a dumpster. You know, we really do have the capacity of expressing ourselves with meaningless violence. You know, like Bluto in Stripes. Not Stripes, Animals. We're going to do something incredibly stupid, and we're just the ones who can do it. And you can see, actually, there was a series of photographs as the police were beating up the demonstrators online. Okay. These are going to be thought to be the really good old days for some of us, and others. Who's Bill Clinton? Oh, his wife's running for president. Yeah, or might. We don't know. Bill Clinton arrives at the demonstration. It went from essentially over a weekend to the next Friday. He arrives on Thursday, on December 2nd, and he goes right at the WTO representatives. And people say, well, of course he's doing that. He wants Al Gore to get elected president. And environmentalists and union organizers, they're the ones he wants to appeal to. But in actual fact, about 4 months before, he committed the United States to policies of assessment and consideration of the environmental impacts of trade agreements, and the trade agreements should contribute to the protocol of sustainable development. And then he did an unheard of thing. He said, if countries violate those kind of trade agreements, we're going to use the WTO's boycott and fining system. In other words, the ones they used against Chiapas. Okay, they're now going to use against the people who are doing bad things to people in Chiapas. Okay, and of course the delegates were shocked. I mean, there's a whole list of these responses like, "How dare he say that?" And these are all leaders of dictatorships, you know, who actually want the money under the table, and they also believe in capitalism. But they're the ones who benefit from this drama. So everyone was in an uproar. Can I get an uproar out of everyone? Right, there's a lot of uproar. And of course, the next day, you know, the delegates were exhausted. After the riots were happening, the protesters were everywhere, and the delegates were afraid to leave their hotel. I just love that. There's something about you can't leave your 5-star hotel, because people are out in the street demonstrating that you're staying in a 5-star hotel, you know, and running the economy in a way that benefits people accused of living in 5-star hotels. So there's a certain kind of magic to that, magical realism. And they said, "I'll try next year in Geneva. You know, we're not going to pass any tariffs here. We're going to go to Geneva." And then Davos and all these other places where there are only 5-star hotels. I slept in a concrete pipe being laid when I was in Davos, so I could afford. I was hitchhiking. You know. Typical freeloading, you know, student time. Okay. So what does Wikipedia say? Well, this is just for educational purposes. When you go to Wikipedia, what you'll get are things known as facts. You'll get no analysis and hardly ever significance. You'll just get stuff, you know. But the stuff it writes isn't necessarily pro the demonstrations and things that happen at the WTO. But it does say people are listening now to these critiques. That's a thing. That's a big step that went a lot further, of course. It changed the way protests are organized. People at the WTO protest all came from different places, different countries, and they're all hooked in by the leadership of their different associations who now have the ability to more easily communicate with other like-minded groups. And those began building upon these alliances to create newer alliances and stronger alliances between all of them. Here you see 10 years after the WTO, 2009, Teamsters and Turtles together still. Right? So this changed, and of course this is going to lead to Occupy Wall Street. This is what that's all about, actually. It's simply, you'll see why, it's a continuation of this. But the idea is that it didn't go away. These kinds of demonstrations, of course, had their critics. The media portrayed the Seattle events as being, crazies. And the reason I got interested in this, actually, was because a very modern, centrist, pro-capitalist producer of Money Matters on NPR, his name is David Brancaccio. He said he was observing the Seattle violence at a distance, that is in Washington. And he said, what's the matter with these people who think they can change the world by turning over and burning some cars? None of which actually happened. That's one thing. He said, they need to find a more constructive way. And it occurred to me, Fox News? I'm making a joke there. The media is owned by multinational corporations. Our movie studios are owned by the Japanese. There isn't any there that belongs to the people of almost any country or any subcontinent. And you know something? If you want cheap delivered media, that's the way it is. It's what the market is dictating. These are people who have children and houses and, well, I guess, Mercedes-Benz. But the point is, you have to look a little more deeply than just the obvious critique that was offered at WTO. Of course, in London, there was a similar event. In fact, WTO protests broke out all over the world, and they continued against every G20 meeting, which is the group of 20, the leading industrial nations. And it's talking about, and what's amazing here, if you've had a chance to read this whole website, is that they're saying everyone predicted in 1999 that there would be a financial collapse, a global financial collapse, because of the irresponsible way the 1% are acting. And of course, they got it in 2009, exactly 10 years later. So it gave a new boost. The recession, the global recession. We got a movie. Of course, it does have Woody Harrelson in it. And Woody Harrelson is a big organic food, promoter, as well as organic food, if you know what I mean. And also Charlize Theron, who actually participated in the film because she believed in the project. It was a fictionalization, but using documentary film. And Ray Liotta, who was in Goodfellas. I guess he knows what really big criminal organizations are like. That's just a joke. Now, of course, then after 2009, that thing that everyone said, irresponsible, unrestricted trade is going to lead to disruptions, and now we actually come into a world that we're very familiar with, isn't it? Increasingly after 2009, the economy started recovering, but CEO compensation went up, but salaries didn't go up. So millions of dollars were added to the salaries of CEOs or in stock benefits, which they deserve for raising the value of their company, but also people whose companies did very badly in the recession also got very high compensation. And so this problem of CEO pay, a lack of changing in the banking and investment structure, the insularity of Group 20, that is those that are running the system don't want to be seen even talking about how they run the system, the growing income equality, which led to the 99 versus 1% argument. And the slogan was boosted, as I mentioned, confirmed by the Congressional Budget Office, that these things were healthy things. And this led, of course, to the Occupy Wall Street movement, which was held in a park where the bull, that famous bull that you see in all those things representing capitalist growth, exists at Wall Street. But this was kind of peaceful, as you probably know. It started out with this poster. It says, what is our one demand? Can you read what it said? Bring tent. Okay. The intent here was to draw attention to a problem. It was a problem now people had become naturalized to. They realized there was a problem with the financial system. If they hadn't after 1999, they did after 2009. I could show you graphs that show how this disparity of wealth increases as the economy recovers. Because more and more of that economic recovery is not going to your average person. And it makes sense. How do you do that anyway? But there's the bull and there's this wonderful free spirit. And of course the whole point of the Occupy Wall Street, look, I can't go back. Darn it. Let's see if I can figure it out here. Here are the actual goals. Reduction of influence of corporation on politics. In other words, don't let money dictate your environmental policy. That means the most to anybody else. It means a lot of other things to others. More balanced distribution of income. I don't know how you do that, but they were in favor of that. More and better jobs. Bank reform, especially to curtail speculative trading by banks. A friend of mine was he's one of the world's leading actuarials. And he was the leading actuarial for Ernst & Young, which is one of the big, I think there are 4 now, big 4 accounting firms. And we would sit and we'd watch a Braves game, and he'd tell me 10 years ago that there was going to be a huge financial meltdown. And it was going to happen because banks were being allowed to being investment banks, that investment companies were looking to banks to structure their investment portfolios, and there were the rules, the accounting rules for both banks and companies were being violated all the time. And unfortunately, both the Bush and Clinton administration released restrictions on the markets that were put in to prevent an economic collapse from the 1930s. All those were gone actually by 1997. And what I like about it is both Republican and Democrat. They both conspired to set us up. Because you could argue they're both paid by the same people. And that's this argument. I mean, that's the argument that the protesters made. And of course, forgiveness of student loans, is that a big deal? Well, to students it is, but also to their parents. Right? And other relief for indebted students. So this looks like a young agenda, doesn't it? I want a better job when I grow up. I don't want to be saddled by student loans. I don't want my bank to go bankrupt or kept solvent by rules which destroy my wages and the economy along with it. So this is a very presentist critique of capitalism. The attack on the WTO is very focused about an endemic problem that's stemming directly from globalization. This comes stemming from these after effects of globalization, in which government has withdrawn from the regulation business and it's letting free marketeers do whatever they want. And essentially the protesters at Occupy Wall Street are saying, we don't want to change the system, we want you to fix it. And everybody got that point, which is really interesting. Well, everybody outside the media, which saw them as filthy people, and by the way, a lot of them are rich, right? Like poor people who without a job can stand around, in New York for a couple of months. But they had a point, okay. So a lot of people said it was anti-capitalist, where it was not. Nicholas Kristof, who's way on the right-wing side of political commentators, actually said capitalists need to be more directly responsible. There's nothing wrong with responsibility. Rolling Stone writer said, as you might imagine, they're not protesting money, they're not protesting banking, they're protesting corruption because of the government withdrawal from regulation. Someone else who's an academic, one of those left-wing professors you have to watch out for, and the right-wing ones too, they're both dangerous to you learning to think in your own right. Capitalism now clearly re-emerging as the name of the problem. Re-emerging, right? From the fall of the Soviet Union, before then, it was always the big villain for a lot of people. Then that villain disappeared, and we didn't want any more villains. Right? They're villains again, but they're not communists. Okay, so on October 5th, 2011, Jon Stewart said in The Daily Show, if the people who were supposed to fix our financial system had actually done it, the people who have no idea how to solve these problems wouldn't be getting, for offering, not offering